Hi everyone! This video is for the Lab Safety and Scientific Method Lab, which is the very first one that you'll be completing. So once you guys get your lab kits, go ahead and take a look at the materials, and I'm going to walk you through how to do the lab today. So first and foremost, for this lab, you're actually going to be placed into groups. So make sure that you check Blackboard to see who's in your group. And I'm giving you guys this video a little bit early so that you have plenty of time to communicate with all group members and find a time that works for everyone to meet. Now, it works really well if everyone can come together in maybe a conference call or on the phones together. If you can't find a time that everyone in your group is available, you can do it back and forth through email and messaging that way, but do try your best to meet together in some type of virtual format. It's going to work really well if everyone's there to add in their observations together, okay? Now for this lab, you have two parts. The second part is where you're actually going to be talking with your group and experimenting, but the first part goes over lab safety. Now that might seem a little silly since we're doing these out of our homes, but it's still incredibly important. So anytime you enter a lab, whether it's at school or in your professions, you need to make sure you know where all of the safety features are. I would be showing those to you if we were in our classroom like usual, but since you're at your house, you're going to work on finding those different things for yourself. So anytime you start a lab, no matter what the lab is, you want to read through the entire procedure before you get started. You want to make sure you understand all the directions that you're asked to do, from top to bottom, so there aren't any surprises. Now that's really important so you can get all of your materials set up. You want to have all of your supplies sitting out in front of you ready to go. If you start an experiment and you have to walk away to get supplies, you could completely ruin the experiment. So think about if you're trying to heat something up to a certain temperature and you step away for a minute and it boils over and you have to start all over again. Or now you have a safety hazard, right? So always make sure to look through the entire procedure and make sure to get out all of your supplies that you need before you start, okay? All right, some other lab safety tips. First and foremost, if you have long hair, it's best to tie it back. So make sure you always pull your hair back. You shouldn't have any dangling earrings when you're in a lab either. No scarves or loose clothes like that, okay? We aren't using Bunsen burners or very dangerous chemicals for these labs, of course, but it's still important to maintain those same professional standards so that you get comfortable with it, and because you could still have dangers in your home. The other really important thing is to make sure your workspace is clear from clutter. We don't want people knocking over glass beakers on accident, bumping chemicals off the table, nothing like that. So make sure that you have a space that is clear from clutter. You can pick any part of your house to do your lab, but I find it's best to have a sink nearby. We will be using water for some of the experiments, but also having a sink is a really great safety feature because if you get a chemical on your hands, on your face, in your eyes, you'll need to flush it out with water. So you should have a sink nearby. Maybe you want to use the kitchen. That's where I usually would do an at-home experiment. Make sure your counters are nice and clean and you have adequate lighting so you can see what you're doing. The other thing about having a clean workspace, free of clutter, is also making sure that any family members are aware of the situation. So if you have any kind of science experiment going on, you want to make sure that you're not going to have anyone bumping it, moving it, eating it, right? So keep an eye on your experiment at all times and make sure it's safe not only for you, but also for your family members. Now, if you have a cat or someone who likes to get on a counter or a table, keep an eye on that especially so that they don't actually knock things over or bump into them on accident, okay? The other thing is we say you should always work in a well-ventilated area. Now, we aren't using chemicals where you would need an actual chemical hood, but in a laboratory, if you're using something with noxious fumes that will irritate your lining if you actually breathe them in, you would have what's called a chemical hood. And it's a workspace, a counter, that has a big vent over it, and it sucks all of those fumes out. So you stand with just your hands in there, working on the chemicals, and there's a screen in front of you protecting your face. So if you go into a lab, you might see something like that. And whoever your lab advisor is or a future instructor, they should be pointing out those features to you and letting you know when you should use it. Other important safety things in a lab, you would always have an eye wash station. and a shower in case you get chemicals on you. Now in your home, hopefully everyone has running water in a sink or a shower, so you can use that if you need to. You should always have a fire extinguisher available as well. Again, we're not really lighting anything on fire or blowing things up, especially not in our homes, but it's important to have a fire extinguisher even in your house, no matter where you are, just in case anything goes wrong. So if you end up in a lab, always make sure you know where their fire extinguisher is. Labs will also have areas for sharps. So if you accidentally broke glass, you should know where to put that to keep it safe. Maybe biohazards. If you're working in a lab with human tissues or blood, there will be a certain space for putting in those biohazards so that they stay contained and away from people. You should also make sure you have a garbage nearby so you can clean up everything afterwards. And do make sure to clean up. You want to keep your space nice and clean. This goes without saying, but make sure not to eat or drink while you're doing your lab. At Cincinnati State, our classrooms that are our laboratories are not allowed to have food or water inside the labs. We cannot even drink water in the lab room. And we do that because there's always a risk of contamination. So you should treat your home space that way. Even though I do the labs in my kitchen, I always make sure that my counters are clear, all of my food is pushed and put away, and I'm not actively eating while I'm touching my chemicals in my experiment. So keep an eye on that as well. Now, as you go through the actual procedure for this lab, it'll talk through different bullet points on safety. So please make sure to read all of those. You're going to go onto Socrates, you're going to go to At-Home Labs, and you're going to pull up the very first lab for lab safety and scientific method. And it's that document that you want to read through in its entirety. Now, as you read through the lab safety section, you'll read all these different bullet points, and there will be a section at the bottom for you to sign saying that you agree and you will abide by these rules. Now, we know that it's electronic. If you want to print it off and sign it, that's fine. If you have a touchscreen computer and you want to sign it, you can do it that way. Otherwise, we assume that when you type, that is your signature electronically. So we will respect that and make sure that you do as well, and you're as careful as you can possibly be in this situation. Okay, once you've gone through the safety section, at the very bottom, you'll read a bullet point on what's called a safety data sheet. Some of you might know this as an MSDS, or Material Safety Data Sheet. These are going to be found for almost every single chemical that is produced in the United States, and they're incredibly important. On a Material Safety Data Sheet, you will see all of the information on how dangerous it is, how to store it, and what to do in first aid situations if you eat it, if it gets in your eyes, anything like that. So we will be looking for SDS sheets on the computer. Now, when you go into a lab and you're working in a physical space, the SDS sheets for the lab stored there, for the chemicals stored in that lab should be printed out and in some kind of binder, or they should be very accessible and easy for everyone to find on a computer. We have these printed at Cincinnati State in our laboratories. Now, of course, we know most of you don't have these sitting around at home, but you could find them in theory for all of your household items, your bleach, laundry detergents, hand soaps, all sorts of things. So in order to find these, all you have to do is do a quick internet search. You can go onto Google, type in the name of the chemical, and type in SDS, or Safety Data Sheet, and it will pull up a whole list of sheets for that chemical. Now, a lot of companies who produce these chemicals will make the sheet, and it will have a very similar setup. So you can click on a few different links and familiarize yourself with how the information is set up on the safety data sheets. We want you to do this, and we want you to know how to do it in case any of these chemicals you're using for your at-home labs become an issue. Now, again, we're not using anything too scary, but let's say, for example, we have Elmer's glue and borax for one of our labs. Let's say on accident, one of your little kids comes over and puts some in their mouth, right? You need to know how dangerous that is. So having those SDS sheets available before you start the lab, looking them up before you begin any kind of experiment, and knowing what to do in those situations is very important. So this experiment will ask you to find an SDS sheet and familiarize yourself with that information. When you go through your assignment, it's also going to ask you to describe your home lab environment. So take some time to think about where in your home you want to do these labs each week. Make sure it's a safe space. Make sure you let your family know that you're doing a lab so they don't accidentally touch it or bump it. If anything does happen to interfere with the lab, you can certainly start over if you have enough materials. But if you don't, say you've used up all of the material that you had for this lab and you messed it up, it's spilled, it's all lost, you couldn't finish it, that's fine. As a scientist, I ask you not to make up your answers, right? That's one of the worst things you could possibly do. So if an experiment goes wrong and you can't restart and fix it, it's okay to say that on your lab reports. Tell me what happened, what went wrong, why you think it went wrong, and then explain maybe what would have happened otherwise. So always admit to any kind of errors that happened. I certainly won't be mad at you for it. But keep an eye on your lab space, and again, make sure everyone in your home knows what's going on at the time that you're doing your labs. It's best to do these labs all in one sitting, so you should start it and make sure you have a couple hours to do it. We dedicate 2 hours for each lab in person, so I would plan to spend about 2 hours doing your labs at home. Each one will be a little different, but make sure you have a full 2 hours just in case so you can get the results done all in one sitting. Sometimes you might mess with it and you might get different results if you stop it and come back to it later. So on your analysis, it's going to ask you to fill out your at-home lab environment. You want to talk about any kind of family members that might be present, where your sink and your eye wash station will be, how you're going to clean up afterwards, anything like that. And it's also going to ask you to draw your at-home lab environment. Now, if you're not an artist, that's okay. Just draw it as best you can, label the different sections. You can either draw on your computer, you can use maybe the paint application and add it in. You can draw it on a piece of paper and take a picture on your phone and insert that image into Word, however you need to do it. And then it's going to ask you to find that SDS sheet that I was talking about. Now that's all for part A on safety. You're then going to come to part B for the scientific method. So this is when you're going to be looking towards your lab groups. So you can do part A by yourself, and then for part B, you're going to want to communicate with your lab group on how best to set up a time to do this, okay? Now, very quickly, before we get into the scientific method part B lab, I want to go over your lab kit with you really quickly. So in the mail, everyone should be getting a box, and it should have all of your lab materials that you need. So I'm going to show you roughly what you'll have in there. First and foremost, you will actually have a sheet that tells you all of the supplies that should be in your lab kit. So this is really handy. You want to check it now when you get it and make sure that you're not missing anything. Because if you wait a couple months until you're doing a lab towards the end of the semester, you're probably going to be out of time for us to send it to you and remedy the situation. So double check that list. Now with these papers, you're also given a couple other things. You're given a periodic table. So the periodic tables are incredibly important for our biochemistry section. I always like to have a couple of these printed out, so you might want to copy this and print a few more at home if you have a printer. They're really nice to draw on and to take notes on as we do biochemistry. You will be allowed to use a blank periodic table, meaning without any of your notes on it, so one just as it arrived in the mail. You're allowed to use a blank periodic table for your exams. And so you can have a paper copy available if it's blank and only if it's blank. No notes on it for tests. So make sure to keep that periodic table handy. You'll also have some cutouts for future labs. So something that looks like this. And then you'll have an electron shell. That should look something like this. Okay. And then I'm not going to show you the sheets for this lab that we're doing today because I don't want to give away any answers. But you should also have a couple sheets for cubes. And you're going to be doing a cube lab for the scientific method. You should also have some coffee filters. You're going to have some plastic beakers. Some little containers to help you out. Okay, remember, this is a Tupperware container that you store food in, but this is for your lab. So don't put any food in it. Don't eat out of it. All right? Keep it separate. You'll also get a little scale, so almost like a kitchen scale that you can measure out things accurately. You should have pipe cleaners, some glue, all sorts of goodies, right? You will even have a ruler and a thermometer. So your thermometer might look a little different than mine, but If you get a glass one, be very careful with it, okay? So this is a nice glass thermometer. It's nice and big because typically how you use these is you can have it in a beaker, measuring whatever solution you have in there, and you can have a metal clamp kind of holding it there for you. So they're really long, so you can have it in the beaker and held for you. Now we don't have those stands to hold it for you at home, so just be careful. It is glass, and you want to keep it in its case when you're not using it. Now, FYI, if anyone's curious, none of these are mercury. They used to be, right? But they aren't anymore. So the material inside is actually a type of alcohol. But either way, be careful with them. They are still glass and they can break. Your lab kit will also contain some Play-Doh. Kind of fun. Haven't seen that in a long time. You'll have what are little Petri dishes, okay? Little plastic containers like that. You should also have some safety goggles. Now, I know some of you might feel a little silly wearing them, but you should always have on your safety goggles when you are doing your labs. There's a chance that chemicals could splash in your eyes. Even if it's just hot water, you should have your goggles on. If you wear glasses, and there's some nice big lenses, those are usually okay. If you were working in a lab with dangerous chemicals, you would have some bigger ones that go around your glasses. You'll also have a test tube, something like this, okay? That's another way to measure things. You'll have a stand for your test tube. So this little guy, you can stand him up. And then you'll have a container with a few other supplies. So you'll have some pipettes in there, some tubes, some borax, which is like a type of laundry detergent almost, the powder. You'll have a little tea candle and then some chemical stains in there and a marble, okay? So all sorts of things. Now make sure that you check your list that they send you of everything that's included, and you check it all off and you make sure you have enough of your supplies. Okay, we're gonna get started with our lab, part B, the scientific method. So take a pause in the video and make sure that you know who's in your lab group and you reach out to them once you know what to do. Okay, to do the scientific method, part B of your lab, you're going to read through all the directions first and foremost, and you're going to make sure you get out all of the materials that you need. So if we look at part B, it's talking about the scientific method and how we design different parts of experiments. So with science, it's so important to make sure we can get empirical data. And if you remember from our lecture, empirical data is that which is observable. So we can either measure it with our sound, maybe we have something that measures decibels, maybe we can view it, maybe we weigh it. There's some way to experience it and to get some kind of observational data from it. It's not just something that we think or we feel, we actually have to be able to measure in some way. So when we think about the scientific method, we want to think about how to design an experiment that we can use observable data. Now, there's a lot of different ways to ask a question for an experiment. You always need to make sure, though, that it's testable. So sometimes you might ask a question about why a certain thing is the way it is, and it's very hard to design an experiment around that. Usually questions that begin with what or which or how are going to be a little bit better at designing an experiment. You want to make sure that, especially for our at-home labs, you're doing something with one variable. It's very hard to change multiple variables and know which one is causing your results. So as good scientists, we like to have controlled experiments where we're only changing one thing at a time, and we can really focus and test just that one variable to make sure that we know what the results are saying. So as you think about this experiment, you want to be thinking like a scientist, and you want to be thinking about how to ask a question in a scientific way. So looking at part 1, you're going to be looking at a cube. Now in your lab box, you got a couple sheets that have cubes on them. I'm not going to show you all of it. Whoop. There we go. Because I have a couple different cubes for each student. Okay, and all together, these cubes are going to be making one whole thing. Now, as you look at your cube directions, it's going to tell you you're actually cutting this out. So when you go to cut out your cube, you should have your scissors and some tape available. Scotch tape would be ideal, something that's transparent. You want to cut just on the outer part of the cube. Okay, so I want to keep it all together. It's going to end up looking like a cross when you cut it out. You don't want to cut out each individual square because then you'll have to tape it all together. It'll be really tough. So keep it all in one big cross. It will end up looking like this after you cut it out. Okay. If you don't know how to fold a cube, it'll be pretty easy, I think, once you cut it out. But essentially, you're going to cut out your shape and you're going to fold every single square on the lines. Okay. And then you're gonna kind of squish it together and you'll have a little cube shape like this. This is where you get your Scotch tape and you tape it all together so it doesn't come apart. So you can go ahead and do that and have it ready for you as you start reading through the directions. So in step 1, it's asking you to observe your cube. So you're gonna be a scientist and you don't know what this cube is, what its purpose is, who made it. You don't really know anything about it, right? It just showed up. And you're probably a little curious. So you're going to be a scientist and you're just going to observe some things about your cube. So imagine that this is some strange animal that you see in the wild and you're just sitting there looking at it. You're maybe thinking about what it's doing, okay? So for this cube, maybe you kind of turn it around and you think, well, who made the cube? Maybe you ask, why are there different things written on the cube? Why are there different colors on the cube? Okay, all sorts of questions. Any questions you have, write them down. Write them down in that very first box. Now, as you go down to section number 2, it's going to ask you to start brainstorming with your team. So this is when you need to communicate with your group members. You want to come up with a list of questions, at least 3 of them, that your group as a whole has about the cube. So share these questions that you came up with and see what your team members think as well, and write down all of these different questions. So as scientists, we're always thinking about how to ask different things and what questions we want to test. And usually that leads to more and more curiosity, so more and more questions that you want to answer. So start thinking about all of these different questions, no matter what they might be. Whatever question you have about the cube, write it down. You're then going to go down to part 3. So part 3 says, go back through that list of questions and cross out the ones that you cannot test. Because again, this is a science class, so we need to be able to have empirical data from it. We can't just think a certain thing. So if you are wondering, who made the cube? Well, you could do some research and ask around, but you can't really experiment or test it, okay? So, because you cannot collect empirical observational data from it, cross that question out. So with your group, go through those questions and cross out any that you don't think you can design an experiment around. Now, this is just to get you thinking about how to ask questions and what questions are testable. There usually are ways of taking a question that you cannot test and rewording it so that you can design an experiment around it. Now, I'm not going to go into exactly how to do that, but as you go through your careers, if there's something you're curious about, maybe you want to do a case study on a patient and it leads to more questions about why something happened the way it did, well, maybe you can start asking how to formulate those questions to test it out in a more manageable way. So once you've gone through your whole list of questions and you've figured out which ones are testable and which ones aren't, you're going to focus just on one question. And the one question that we want you to think about is, what is on the bottom of the cube? So on everyone's cube, the bottom is labeled, okay? And all it says is that's the bottom of the cube. We don't know what is actually on the bottom. So if we were doing this in person, it would actually be glued down, so we couldn't see the bottom at all. So in this case, we see that it's written bottom, and we want to know, well, what exactly is that? So your question is what's on the bottom of the cube, okay? You're going to go back through and read your notes that you collected with that question in mind, and you're going to circle any evidence that will help you answer that question. So all those observations you made, you're going to go through and see which ones are going to be useful for answering this particular question. It's good to have tons of observations, but not all of them will help you answer the cube, all right? So go through, circle the ones that you think will help you out, or highlight it if you're using your computer. And then you're going to keep going through the steps. You're going to be talking through your lab groups as you go. Now, I'm not going to walk you through all of this because I want you to be able to experience it on your own. But as you go through, it's going to ask you to review your notes and think about how we can try to figure out what is on the bottom of the cube. You're going to circle any evidence that you find and cross out things that won't help you. And then when you get to question 7, there's actually a chart that you can fill out. So as we come up with evidence, as we collect these observations, we can then start to think about what that means. So we have an observation and we want to think about the claim. What can we say about it? What can we conclude? So it's not enough just to ask a question. We have to find the data and then come up with an answer for it. We have to think about what that data means. So you're going to fill out your table, what you noticed and what it means about your cube. And then down below, you'll see a blank net for the cube in question 8 where you can actually draw and label what you think to be the answer to the question, what's on the bottom of the cube, right? Now, if you keep scrolling down, you'll notice a section called analysis. So the analysis after a lab is really where you start to think about critically all of the information that you did. Why did we do that lab? What did it teach you? So you want to think about how this was similar to what scientists do. Now, it might seem a little silly just to be talking about a paper cube, but it's the same process that a scientist will go through. And even if you're not going to go into a lab, you can still act as a scientist no matter what career you're in. There are always going to be questions that need answers and new ways to grow in your knowledge, especially in the healthcare world. So being able to ask these questions and test it out in a sound way and get sound data is an incredibly important thing to do. So think about what specific actions you performed that you would use in the scientific method. Think about the data you collected. Was all of it important, or did you cross some of it out and ignore it? And what do you think about the bottom of the cube? Are you certain about your answer that you came up with as a group? What do you think? So I hope you guys have fun with this lab. It's a pretty nice one to get started with. You can meet some of your classmates and work together a little bit on this. Make sure to fill out your lab homework as completely as you can with nice complete sentences and good grammar. You want it to be as professional looking as you can. And again, feel free to contact me with whatever questions you might have. Good luck!